Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is our Year of the Heart, and today's video is going to be another chapter of Brené Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart, that we've been going through this year. It's chapter 8, The Places We Go When We Fall Short. And I think a lot of people are going to be able to relate to this one. For some reason, I don't know what it is, if it's our culture or maybe it's just about being a woman or it's the generation that people my age were raised by. There's a big issue with a lot of us in terms of being perfect or feeling like we have to strive to be loved. We talked a lot about this last year in the book discussion Enough by Laurie McCammon, and how we struggle for that enoughness a lot of times. So this book is really like the pinnacle too for Brené's work, because it discusses shame, which you know is Brené's main aspect of her research. So when you think about when you fall short, of course, I'm sure shame comes to mind. What other things? Maybe just inadequacy, maybe that perfectionism comes up, and maybe feeling like we're not lovable, like I said. These are the words that she has. Shame, self-compassion, so that's going to be something she'll talk about, how that's really important that we give that to ourselves. Perfectionism, like I mentioned. Guilt, I didn't think to say that, but that could be the case too, right? If you fall short, there could be some guilt around that. Humiliation. Yeah, she has a really interesting portion of this chapter about humiliation, and then the last word is embarrassment. So she talks about the difference between humiliation and embarrassment. And if you get a chance to read this chapter, it starts on page 133 in the book, you might realize that you have an issue with one of these words that you didn't even know you had, because I've always felt a connection with the shame, and I've always resonated or felt like Brené's words has resonated with my own experience in terms of shame that I carry around over stupid things that some are big, some are small, but just kind of based on my own childhood upbringing. But I had never really thought about humiliation, because when you think about being humiliated, doesn't it seem like a huge word? Like it seems like you can't show your face again. It's like the end of the world. I think about people now that are on TV or celebrities or reality TV shows where people just rip them apart in social media, and they must feel humiliation. And I guess when I think about my life, I don't necessarily have these moments of feeling totally humiliated. Like when I think about it, I'm not thinking like, oh, there's this one moment where I felt completely humiliated, like I was just, naked in front of the town or something like that. But as I was reading this chapter, I thought, wow, there are little moments that are more than embarrassment that I can think about myself, that maybe they became a feeling of humiliation for me. And somehow I've either like forgotten that, or maybe I've tried to push it down. So you might find that I did in reading chapter 8 that there are some things that come up for you that you weren't really expecting. So of course I mentioned shame is the big thing that she, as a researcher of shame, talks about a lot. And she says in this book that she didn't think that she would come up really with a new definition because she's studied it for so long, but she did sort of come up with a little tweak on it. So when we hear the word shame, our first thought is either, I have no idea what that means, or I don't want to know, right? Or I know exactly what that means, and I don't want to talk about it. We can also make up that shame is something that happens to other people, not to us. But shame is in all of us. And she lists out some examples of things, like not making partner, getting a DUI, things like even shame and infertility. Like I wouldn't think that, but that could be for somebody, like that they go to shame. Flunking out of school, hearing your parents fight through the walls and just being afraid. So some of these things, it's not like humiliation. Some of these things you might have actually a feeling of shame about that are just because things didn't work out the way that they were quote unquote supposed to, right? We all have it, Brené says. Shame is universal and one of the most primitive emotions that we experience. The only people who don't experience it are those who lack the capacity for empathy and human connection. We're all afraid to talk about it. Sometimes we feel shame when we just hear the word shame. But it's getting easier as more people are talking about it. The less we talk about it, the more control it has over us. Shame hates being spoken. So she goes on to talk about how one way to overcome shame, and she said this before in other books, is to talk about the shame. And that there can be a sort of normalization, or she goes into self-compassion, how you can have compassion for the situation. Like if I take something like the person is ashamed because they didn't make partner in their law firm or whatever. If you can have self-compassion for yourself and get yourself out of that shame place in it and think, well, I didn't get it this time, or I tried really hard and I deserved it, but I haven't gotten it, then you can kind of lessen the shame with some self-compassion. She has a definition of shame right here. Okay, here's the definition of shame that emerged from her research prior, and then also this book. Like I said, she had a little tweak on it. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. So that's the main point of the shame. It's that, well, she says later that it's that you are bad. It's not that you did something bad. It's that you're just not right. You shouldn't be loved because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, or things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to, or you made a different choice than everybody else. And it's an internal feeling that translates to you being completely worthless in a sense. So shame is pretty deep. It's pretty deep. So remember in The Gifts of Imperfection, we talked about the word resilience, and that was one of the guideposts that Brené said, that the people that are living a wholehearted life, they have resilience, which means that they can bounce back from things. They can realize that everybody's human and make mistakes, and they can go on with their life. They have fortitude to just keep going no matter how hard something is. And so she talks about this shame resilience, which is, if you're going to constantly feel shame, then you're just going to be stuck forever. So you have to find a way to come to this point of resiliency where shame is concerned, to actually move on, or to open your heart up, or whatever it is, to make that next step towards maybe the fear that you have in not measuring up, but overcoming that to take the next step. These are my words, but I'm just paraphrasing some of the things that she says in here. I'm not going to go into super detail about self-compassion, because I think that one sort of makes sense in just the way that it sounds, right? That you're going to have compassion for yourself. And it goes along with this resiliency, because if you can have self-compassion for yourself, you're probably going to have some shame resilience as well, because you're going to say, it's okay, I made a mistake, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that I'm not lovable. It doesn't mean that I am flawed in any way. It doesn't mean I'm a failure for the rest of my life just because of this one thing. So that would be being self-compassionate. She also says there's things within that, like self-kindness, not being self-judgmental, having humanity about things. Like I said, I'm only human. Being mindfulness, and not over identifying with something in particular. So the 4 elements of shame resilience on the other side of that is recognizing shame and understanding that there are triggers that bring it on. Practicing critical awareness, like having a reality check about like what is true, what am I saying to myself about this, but what is actually true. Sometimes talking to a professional or just a friend that's understanding can really help you sort that out. Reaching out. Are you owning your story and sharing it, she says? And speaking shame. So remember it said that shame doesn't want to be heard. It's almost like that's the kryptonite to shame when you start to share it. I don't feel like personally that I could get up on a stage and say all the things that I have shame about. I guess the things that I feel are out of my control in terms of maybe something I have shame about from my early childhood that isn't really like a decision that I made, then I could probably talk about that. But later as an adult in my life, I definitely have shame about decisions that I made, or staying in certain situations, or not living up to maybe my potential. I don't know if everybody has that particular bar for themselves. But I can see what she's saying about sharing it and how it would help if you were in a support group, and just to talk about other people, and maybe hearing that they made worse mistakes, and you could probably be like, wow, mine isn't really that bad after hearing what other people did. I heard one time, this is over 10 years ago, somebody had told me that there was this website that you could go and you could actually anonymously type in like bad things that you had done that you had just wanted to like get out there to the world. And I kind of remember thinking like, wow, like who would do that? But then when you think about it, maybe that person does just want to be anonymous and just wants to say like, one time I did this, and then somebody else could go, well, I did that too, you know, it's okay, and this is how I got over it. So maybe there is a way to sort of not get up on the stage and say it, you know, everybody knowing who you are, but maybe you can find an outlet like that where you are anonymous and talk about things and have other people sort of have compassion for you from their point of view too. She talks about shame in culture too a little bit. Like I mentioned, there is the social media aspect of things. I never could have made it through my teenage years if I had to have all of the things that kids have nowadays. Where perfectionism exists, shame is always lurking. Yeah, because if you have that perfect bar for yourself, we've talked about perfectionism before on the channel, especially during our Simple Abundance year when we were going through Sarah Ban Breathnach's book. She was somebody who admittedly struggled with being a perfectionist and constantly had to really work to not let that control her, to the point of experiencing negative emotions like shame and other things. So shame is at the birthplace of perfectionism. Doesn't that make sense? Because if you think you have to be perfect, you might even equate the perfectionism as you being lovable. And if you don't measure up to that, then you have the shame and you're automatically like, I am worthless. I don't even deserve to live. I don't deserve for anybody to care about me. And you could just go down that rabbit hole. Perfectionism is not striving to be our best or working towards excellence. That would be healthy striving, because that is internally driven. Perfectionism is externally driven by a simple but potentially all-consuming question: what will people think? Yeah. Have you ever sat down to really think about your biggest fear? There was a question that came up in a I think it was an Abraham Hicks video I was listening to not too long ago, where Abraham said something like, I feel inadequate when, and then like the blank was there and you could fill it in. And that kind of got to the bottom of, you know, when people think such and such, then I feel, you could put shame in there too. Then I feel shame, because inadequacy would be a part of shame, I would think. And that might be an interesting question to think about if you haven't really been doing any self-reflection, to see where you're at in terms of what it is that are your shame triggers. I know a lot of times I'm always thinking, I never I never want anybody to think that I didn't try or do my best. And I hate being falsely accused of anything, like somebody not understanding me. I get very defensive, and I think that comes from me wanting to be perfect or not wanting to be wrong or be in trouble, I guess, if you say, like, you think about it as a kid. And I equate being in trouble when I think about being a kid, and I was spanked, and it was extremely painful and embarrassing, and probably would equate with humiliation. So to me, even as an adult, I think there's something still in me that is triggered by being afraid that I might be in trouble in some way, or that I've done wrong. And I'm my worst critic, so I will always do my best no matter what, because I'm so afraid that somebody would ever think that I didn't try or that I didn't give 150% or more. And I'm sure I overwork and do other things because I'm trying to prove my worth, maybe to myself still. Of course, it's a lifelong journey. It may seem counterintuitive, but one of the biggest barriers to working towards mastery is perfectionism. In our leadership research, we learned that achieving mastery requires curiosity and viewing mistakes and failures as opportunities for learning. Yeah. Perfectionism kills curiosity by telling us that we have to know everything, or we risk looking less than. Perfectionism tells us that our mistakes and failures are personal defects. Like I said, remember before with the shame, it's like that is something internal within you. You're bad, you're wrong, at your core, you're just not doing things right, you know? Perfectionism tells us that our mistakes and failures are personal defects. Sorry, I read that again. So we either avoid trying new things, or we barely recover every time we inevitably fall short. You might not fall short if you really, really try your best to do the perfectionist stuff, but it's exhausting, and you're probably never going to live up to your own expectations. Other people might think that you're amazing, and you might never have to worry about them thinking that you're not trying, but in your mind, you might always have that benchmark that you're never going to reach. So she talks about the book, The Gifts of Imperfection, that I mentioned earlier. And by the way, I do have videos on that if you look on my channel. In The Gifts of Imperfection, Brené says, I explain how perfectionism emerged from our research. The definition that best fit the data is that perfectionism is a self-destructive and addiction. It's an addictive belief system that fuels this primary thought. If I look perfect, live perfectly, work perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. Ding, ding, ding. Is that where you are? Because that is where I live most of the time. Because I'm constantly trying to make sure that I measure up. So, and obsessive, yeah, it can be obsessive. That's why some of us are workaholics. That's why some of us have no time for hobbies, because we're just constantly trying to finish everything, or it doesn't even have to be work. It could be that we have to look perfect when we leave the house, or our houses have to look perfect, and to the point that we're like not even enjoying living or things like that, because we're just letting these other obsessive things get in the way that don't even really matter that much, right? But if you got this impression when you were growing up that maybe your parents did praise you when you were perfect or better than others, or your room was clean and they loved it, but then when it was messy, you were terrible and you couldn't do things and you got punished, and then of course you're gonna have this feeling of always needing to measure up. Maybe your parents were even cold to you when you were not doing what they wanted you to do, or they really only did praise you when you were doing the good things. So you're going to probably equate your worth, as well as whether someone else is going to give you love, with whether you do measure up, or if you're quote unquote perfect. So what about guilt? I'm sure we can feel guilt about a lot of things. I think it's interesting that guilt comes up in this particular chapter about not measuring up. So, and am I saying that correctly? Hold on one second. When we fall short. Okay. So, same thing. But I was thinking, you having guilt about something could also be related to somebody else. Like if you let that person down, or maybe you made a bad decision that affected you and another person, and your lack of being perfect, if you want to go that route, brings guilt because it hurt somebody else too. Like I'm thinking about, like, you know, in a relationship situation, like if you stepped outside of your relationship and, you know, then that comes out and then you have guilt about it, and it's like a not measuring up thing. I didn't stay faithful. I hurt someone else. Like I'm just not good. I'm not lovable. It's a really bad cycle. So like shame, guilt is an emotion that we experience when we fall short of our own expectations of standards. But like she said, in terms of shame, if you have no empathy and you can't even connect with other people, then you may not ever experience guilt. You may not ever experience shame. There are people that are masochistic, that just totally, or homicidal, that can kill without any sort of guilt or feelings of remorse or anything. So not everybody has shame or guilt. I mean, it is a human thing, but there are people that don't feel it. With guilt, our focus is on having done something wrong and on doing something to set things right, like apologizing or changing our behavior. So yeah, if you're guilty, you definitely want to get rid of that feeling, right? So you're going to be thinking about, well, what could I do? Could I write the person a letter? Could I try to talk to them over lunch and smooth it over? Could I go to AA and go through the steps and make amends with everybody? You know, some of these things go really deep. While shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence and aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying, guilt is negatively correlated with these outcomes. So empathy and guilt work together. We talked about empathy last time, right? In the last chapter in Brené's book. Empathy and guilt work together to create a force that is adaptive and powerful. This is why when we apologize for something we've done, make amends, or change a behavior that doesn't align with our values, guilt, not shame, is most often the driving force. Interesting that you have to feel guilty, really, to make the changes, to make amends with someone. Why do you think that is? Is that because having something wrong and doing something to set things straight? Well, so that's the difference, I guess, is what the part of the guilt that's a little bit different is the shame. Then the shame is that with guilt, you feel the need to make amends with someone else. Maybe there isn't that with shame, because sometimes shame is more of a singular personal experience versus it might be like your own measuring up versus like something that didn't go right that affected others. Excuse me. And then we go into humiliation. I really thought really differently about humiliation after reading this chapter. Based on the research, we can define humiliation as the intensely painful feeling that we have been unjustly degraded, ridiculed, or put down, and that our identity has been demeaned or devalued. So remember I said that I really get triggered if somebody has falsely accused me? That, to me, I never really thought of that in terms of humiliation, but that fits in there because it feels like my character's being attacked, or that they've demeaned me, or they're, you know, like they're not understanding me. So I guess I never really thought of humiliation as being like a thing that I would really think about, or that I would be like, yes, I have issues with humiliation. But after reading this, I'm realizing that I do. Humiliation is most similar to shame in that we feel fundamentally flawed. Yeah. But the most relevant distinction is that humiliation arises because someone else pointed out our flaws. Yeah, isn't that horrible? Remember, it was like, what will people think? Like that was a part of the shame. Yeah, that's terrible. Like, maybe that's my biggest fear, is being humiliated. Like I said, I'm worried about whether people will think that I did my best or whatever, and then I would feel completely humiliated because they wouldn't be understanding me. Maybe I did do my best and then they didn't think I did, and then I'd be feeling all defensive and knowing that I did and they didn't see it. So I think humiliation's really at the heart of a lot of things for me that I never really realized. The entire key to understanding humiliation is that when it happens to us, it feels unjust. Well, yeah, I can understand that too. Because if somebody is falsely accusing you, that feels completely unjustified, right? Because you know it's wrong and you know that you're right. And so it just feels like I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this humiliation because I tried my best and they're saying I didn't do it well or I made a mistake and they called me out for it. It sounds horrible. I hate talking about it. So, she goes on to talk a lot about humiliation. Humiliation can trigger a series of reactions, including social pain, decreased self-awareness, increased self-defeating behavior, and decreased self-regulation that ultimately lead to violence too. I guess I better be careful, right? There's a lot of research that she mentions in here as well with other colleagues and what they've discovered about humiliation. It's really interesting. I think you should read it. The connection between humiliation and aggression and violence that I just mentioned, it explains much of what we're seeing in today's society, she said too. Amplified by the reach of social media, dehumanizing and humiliating others are becoming increasingly normalized along with violence. It is true. We talked a little bit, I think, recently in a video when I mentioned the school shootings, and I said that kids, a lot of times, they don't feel any human connection. They don't feel like a pride in their school. They don't feel like they belong. And I don't mean many kids that are going to go do a school shooting, but I just mean, I think that there are a lot of disconnected people. And I don't even think, this is not a political statement, but I don't even think it's an issue with guns or anything. It's that we're not putting work into the youth and giving them like the Mr. Rogers care that maybe this generation needs. I mean, all the things that they have to deal with the social media, and yeah, even that website I mentioned where you can be anonymous, you can totally be anonymous on social media too. In some respects, you can make fake accounts and just go off on people and say that they're worthless and the decisions they made are terrible, and they don't have to say that to the person's face, but the person might be reading that. It's terrible. Yeah. What about embarrassment, though? It's interesting we talked about humiliation first, because now embarrassment is just like, oh, yeah, I was embarrassed, right? It doesn't seem like it would be as big as being humiliated. Embarrassment is a fleeting feeling. It's a self-conscious discomfort in response to a minor incident that was witnessed by others. Yeah, so there's usually other people involved with the embarrassment. Yeah. When we feel embarrassed, we can feel exposed, flustered, and clumsy. But we tend to respond to our embarrassment in non-threatening ways. Like maybe we might use humor, she says, saying we're sorry, or sometimes just moving on and not even acknowledging it. Yeah, it's kind of like those forgettable things. It was embarrassing in the moment, and you might go, oh my God, that was so embarrassing. But then when you think about it later, you think, well, people saw it, but I didn't really know any of those people. I don't have to see them on a day-to-day basis. They don't even know my name. And you can kind of rationalize it. It's not like, I think humiliation is like the grand like moment of just like your life will never be the same because of this one moment. It was so horrible and shameful. Some research suggests that there are 3 types of events that can trigger embarrassment. 1, committing a faux pas or a social mistake. 2, being the center of attention. And 3, being in a sticky social situation. Embarrassment can be kind of funny too, right? I think about it in sitcoms and things like that, where you're just watching and you kind of like feel embarrassed for the character, but at the same time, it's funny. So it's not as serious. Just in case you're wondering, the secondhand embarrassing feeling, just in case you're wondering, the secondhand embarrassment feeling is real. We absolutely can feel vicariously embarrassed when we see others in an embarrassing situation, right? Even complete strangers. If we know the person in the embarrassing situation, it's even worse. It's easier when you're watching a sitcom, right? Embarrassment can take years to develop, she says, and its emergence coincides with the self-conscious ability to understand what others may be thinking of us. That's true. As you're a little baby and you're doing stuff, and you might be aware that people are laughing at you, but you don't really get it. But then there's probably a moment that you might remember in your own life where you finally realized that something that you did was really unacceptable because of your awareness of other people's reaction to it. Could have been that everything was fine in your own family, but then you went out in public and did something that you would do at home and they would just sort of laugh at. But then people in public made some sort of big thing about it, or you got in trouble at school or something. But hopefully you're not scarred for life with embarrassment. I think I have to read this chapter again, too, because I really think that there's a lot to be learned from these things. And for me, this is very personal because I do have that striving feeling. And somehow I did learn as I was growing up that you want to do your best and you want people to, look up to you or admire you. And you don't want to be... You don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be humiliated. So I think I'm always trying to perform so that I can avoid feeling humiliation, shame, and embarrassment on whatever scale that is. How do you guys feel about this? Is this something that you also struggle with? I noticed, and I didn't say too much about it in this chapter, but the next chapter is the places we go when we search for connection. And remember, this entire book, whenever she talks about any of these emotions, she will talk about it in terms of connection. And shame is something that disconnects us from others, which is why she talks about it's so important to really not be afraid to talk about your shame and bring it out in the open and really connect with others over it. Maybe going to that sort of a website that's anonymous would help you connect with others, even if it's anonymously, and maybe to work through some of the feelings of shame. And so we're going to talk about in the next one, when we search for connection, what happens. You might feel shame or shame might be stopping you from connecting with others. So we'll be talking about that one next time. And that's just so much a part of being a human, right? We could go off and live in the woods by ourselves, but it's not the same human experience as being connected with others, which we're somehow like tribal in nature, I think, just as a human race. So I'm looking forward to that one. I'll definitely do that one before the end of the month, too, because we've got a bunch to catch up with so that I end on the right month and the right chapter to end 2022. Thank you so much for being here. Please leave me a comment. Love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for all the likes. I've got a ton of new subscribers lately. Thank you for that as well. If you haven't subscribed, you can always hit the like button, subscribe. The bell tells you when I have a new video. I do usually do at least one, if not two, a month now. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Love to you all. Bye-bye.